Hello, everybody. Welcome to Shrink Think. This is our show for therapists on common errors in the treatment of survivors of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse, which we call pathological love relationships. This show is sponsored by the Association for NPD Psychopathy Survivor Treatment at survivortreatment.com. I'm Chelli Pumphrey, one of your co-hosts, and I am a licensed professional counselor and the author of Insight in 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. And today I am joined by our co-host and fearless leader, Sandra Brown. Sandra, would you like to introduce us or introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Sandra Brown. I'm the president at the association and also the director over at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. I'm the author of the book, Women Who Love Psychopaths and How to Spot a Dangerous Man.
All right. Well, I'm excited for the show today because I think this is one of the most, well, there's many important topics, but this is a big one for this population. So today we're going to be talking about one of the consistently missed elements in this population's treatment, which is cognitive dissonance. And this is not just your normal old cognitive dissonance that you learned about in Psychology 101, but Sandra will go into this for us. I wanted to say that, finding out about cognitive dissonance and the way that Sandra has done research on this was a total game changer for me and how I was treating survivors. And it helped me understand why they were so stuck. And it helped me understand, we often talk about a trauma bond, or we would see these certain behaviors where clients would come in and just be, 1 minute they're loving their partner, the next minute they're talking about all this abuse they've suffered. And it was very confusing for them and confusing for therapists as well. So I really feel like this information is so important for us to understand as therapists who work with these survivors. So, Sandra, can you share how you came to identify CD as a major component in these survivors and relationships?
Yeah, to hear it out there, it just, on the internet, it makes it sound like we've always had this realization. And it took me a number of years to try to figure it out because I couldn't figure out what that stuckness was in between the loving and loathing and wanting and not wanting. And I wasn't sure if it was like a defense mechanism or what it was, but what stood out to me was a lot of neurocognitive issues, not being able to stay on the same page with how they felt about the relationship or the person. And it didn't match the college textbook of what we learned in graduate school that cognitive dissonance is. And what was very confusing for me initially is that it made their trauma present differently. And it looked almost more like dependency. So I was not even sure that we should probably call it cognitive dissonance the way that we understood it, in college. And it probably, even today, needs its own word because the version is so different. And so we tried to name it something different. We called it chronic and persistent cognitive dissonance. And it's so much more severe than what they studied in generalized cognitive dissonance. For instance, they tend to study things like smoking cessation or job monotony. And what these survivors have going on is so much more severe than the presentation that we were given of regular generalized cognitive dissonance.
Right. Cognitive dissonance is confusing because it's actually considered to be a social theory about how people deal with internal conflict, which isn't the totality of how we see it in this population. Um, you know, Generally speaking, what's been my experience with survivors is, kind of like I started to say in the beginning, you see somebody come in for a session and they're, first of all, just kind of having this urgency to tell all these stories of what's happened in this relationship. And over time, you'll see in every session, you might go through, I always call it looped thinking. It's like
Mhm.
1 minute they're thinking about how wonderful this is my soulmate. And the next minute they're shutting down and having trauma responses in a session as they talk about the horrendous abuse they're experiencing or the confusion because they're being gaslit or lied to. And so there's just this tendency to kind of see them go through these kind of loops of thinking about themselves, about the partner, about the relationship in general. Um, and if you try to kind of, get in there and talk about, well, this person's abusing you, they'll go right back into, but I love him so much, or, she's so amazing, or, whatever all the good feelings are. It's just extremely confusing. So, Sandra, I know you studied this version of CD for
Mhm.
years now. So, what what did you determine that creates it in survivors?
Well, what was unusual about this is that 100% of them had this one symptom, this deep, paralyzing kind of conflict about how they felt, about their partner. And it prevented them from consistent, rational decision making and from taking the next steps in action. And even when they made a decision, the next week they were back to, wavering back and forth about it. And since they had it, most had CD over the course of most of the relationship, it had lasted for years or even decades. And since they all had it, I began to look at the possible causations of it, which I figured had to be an influence from both the survivor and it wasn't an either or um, thing. What was happening was caused by the relational dynamics of both partners.
Well, let's start with their pathological partner. So, what was contributing there?
Um, the partner's pathological personality was the perfect storm or the perfect structure for inducing or creating cognitive dissonance. And they have, two distinct sides to their personality, or what we often refer to as the Jekyll and Hyde persona.
Yeah, the love bombing and reward behavior we see in that Jekyll and Hyde personality survivor. Well, the love bombing and reward behavior we see in Jekyll that survivors perceive as that good behavior.
Right, right. And that's, one side of the persona in which they develop a relationship with that side of the partner.
Yeah.
And the survivors has their own set of memories and emotions about Jekyll, and even skill sets for how to interact with that Jekyll side during the relationship. And all pathological partners present this side, in the early part of the relationship, the love bombing and attentive side in the early relationship. And then we'll represent it when they need to hook the survivor back in, during the relationship. And on the opposite side, then there is the Hyde persona.
Right. The side that they see as abusive and punishing and perceive as bad behavior.
Right, right. And that's another side of the persona in which they develop a relationship with and have their own sets of memories and emotions about Hyde, and even skill sets for how to interact with that side of the relationship.
So in essence, they are in two different relationships.
Exactly. In most normal relationships, there isn't such a distinct different sides to normal people. We're more fluid, if you will, in our personalities. The relationship dynamics then take on the different sides and behaviors of the two personas and become what we know is part of abusive relationships. The idealization or the Jekyll love bombing and reward types of behaviors that are then intermingled with the devaluation or Hyde behavior of abuse and devaluing. And the survivor is constantly shifting between these extremes in the partner's personality, and those dynamics become part of the relationship, dynamics for years or decades.
Mhm. And that's what produces the conflicted feelings and decisions that become part of CD.
In this version of CD, in this chronic and persistent version of CD, it does. What we had to figure out was why it didn't resemble the kind of CD in the college textbooks, which what they talk about is this short-term condition that is reduced by making the decision, which is generalized CD. But in this type of CD, because it's tied to this long-term relationship that goes on for years or decades, one needed decision just sort of rolls into the next because the partner's behavior keeps changing and changing the parameters she's trying to make a decision about.
Right. So it produces confusion. So she's trying to make decisions about abusive behavior, but the next few weeks, it's all good behavior. Then it starts over again, and she has to contemplate which is the predominant behavior.
Right. And it becomes this contrasting or conflicting perceptions, which ends up paralyzing the decision making. And it sits in the mind as an overwhelming amount of experiences to work through. And in trauma, for instance, we recognize that there are overwhelming amount of experiences need to be processed, but we weren't doing that with this overwhelming amount of conflicting experiences. We know to do that in trauma, but what we weren't doing was doing it with the cognitive dissonance.
Right. And as therapists, we've tended to focus on the bad experiences that represent the traumatic experiences without recognizing in the pathological love relationships that there are these second set of experience that are still part of their experience and memories.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And these positive experiences over years and decades, piled up, and survivors experience those positive experiences as traumatic to experience, even though in therapists, we were not recognizing that they experienced it as traumatic. And so, in essence, what we were doing is we left one part of their traumatic experience unworked with or unprocessed.
So why do survivors consider this second side of positive memories traumatic to experience?
In some survivors, it represents as much, if not more, trauma to them because, as we know, what we call the trauma cocktail is made up of the components of fear and powerlessness. And the positive experiences also for these survivors create fear and powerlessness because it sets off the cravings for the relationship and a loss of control over the cravings. And, most of them come to recognize that their positive experiences are what fuels the makeup and breakup cycles that we know as relapse.
Mm.
And so positive memories, flood, just like traumatic memories do, flood their system only with oxytocin, just like trauma memories flood the body with adrenaline.
Right. So they're having dual experiences and memories, and even as a even on a neurochemical level, and that's part of the CD conflict.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
And so what we studied as we compared the parts of the brain that PTSD affects, since most of this population is a trauma population, and then we compared it to the parts of the brain that cognitive dissonance affects, and what we found is that it is almost the same identical brain regions. And so what that means is that they are having a dual impact from trauma and CD neurologically.
Wow. So I think as trauma therapists, that should really make us sit up and take notice because we already know how impactful trauma is to the brain as an organ and the mind as the psychological structure, and how to and now to have it happening from like two sources is really concerning.
Right. In trauma, for instance, we know that prolonged trauma rewires the brain, which affects their executive functioning system, which is some of the symptoms that we see in survivors with trauma.
Yeah, we see that in trauma and the neuro condition like decision making, judgment, rationale, concentration, and memory. So are we saying that CD is doing this too?
Absolutely. And fMRIs of people that even have a tiny bit of cognitive dissonance shows impact to the brain while they're having a CD conflicted kind of thought. So we have to multiply those effects for this population of survivors who have hundreds of conflicting thoughts that have lasted years and decades, which affects, their neuro condition and their executive functioning. So they have even, more impact than survivors with trauma only, which explain to us, at least, why their neurocognitive impairments was so much more severe than what we were seeing in trauma-only survivors. And consequently, why they had such widespread treatment failure as well.
So is there anything else contributing to the neuro impact that they're having?
Well, like I mentioned, it is a double impact or a double whammy. So all the things that we know that trauma does to the brain that becomes a problem to executive functioning. And then everything we're now knowing that CD also does to the brain that becomes, problems also in executive functioning. And so there's a particular issue, which is in fMRIs, we can see that CD causes what's called hyperneural cognition, and that there is a lot of brain activity and comparing and contrasting the memories of Jekyll and Hyde and the emotions about those memories. And the word they use is hyperneural activity, which is, a lot of brain activity, which is actually similar in trauma in the hyperarousal state when the central nervous system is activated. So in this state, the hyperarousal state is the neural activity. Both we need to consider as therapists that a survivor is having two hyper arousal states, one in the emotional dysregulation in trauma, and another one in the cognitive dysregulation in CD. And then we also found that some survivors who have certain personality elevations that we call super traits are prone to developing cognitive dissonance and prone to developing it more severely than others.
Right. So it's almost like a clustering effect where you have the same areas of the brain being dually impacted, and both conditions have a hyperarousal effect, both affecting their executive functioning and also having a personality prone to developing it severely.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And we have to add that these states have been, of course, happening over years and decades, slowly changing their neurofunctionality, which over time, of course, changes their behavior as well. And it makes total sense why their neurocognitive condition is so bad and in such bad shape when they come into treatment. At least that's what caught my attention, was what a bad shape they were in neurocognitively.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. So it appears we've been trying to treat this all wrong, basically. We've used trauma 101 approaches and treat the perceived negative memory and haven't worked with the perceived positive memories, which are also traumatic to experience.
Right.
Yeah.
And the fact is, we can't even work with the traumatic memories until we reduce the cognitive dissonance, because the dissonance keeps the brain locked up and the decision making paralyzed. And it's why traditional trauma treatment for this population isn't 100% effective, because what we are working with is more than trauma only. And so this is why therapists who are going to work in this genre need specialized training, because this is different than what we have used with trauma only clients.
Right. Well, so the good news is that you've been developing our gold standard training, and even the ability to get certified in working or treating survivors with all of these modalities you're talking about. And if therapists who are listening want to learn more, you can go to survivortreatment.com and find all about the training and other resources that Sandra and the association have available. So thank you for listening today. Hope it was helpful.